Okay, so we are now recording. Popping you up to the top of my screen so I can make sure I'm trying to look you in the eye as much as I can, with the awkward Zoom positioning.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes, I
Okay.
understand.
All right, I'm going to do a little introduction. Oh, Alan, this is so exciting. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Fowler, and I'm the author of the South Carolina History Newsletter. And I would love to welcome you to our first ever video interview with a South Carolina history expert. It's really been a dream of mine over the past couple months to interview South Carolina historians, authors, curators, and more to supplement the newsletter and provide a resource to this growing community of history lovers. So today I'm thrilled to introduce and welcome Mr. Alan Piercy. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kate.
And
Thrilled to be here.
awesome. Alan was one of my first and really wonderful supporters when I started the newsletter a couple months ago. And um, Alan and I were chatting earlier, and I just want to say again, I can't thank you enough for your support early on when I was doing my 100 posts in 100 days. He would be one of the first people to write a comment. He would reply back with ideas for future newsletters, and just really somebody who loves history and was a big supporter. So I'm really grateful to you for that, Alan. I thought if I'm going to start doing these interviews, who would be the perfect first person for me to interview? And Alan was the first person that came to mind. So I'm really grateful. And actually, Alan, I don't know if you know this, or maybe we already talked about it, but early on in the newsletter, when I was scouring the internet for South Carolina history events, I featured your event in Spartanburg, and it was a few weeks after that you became a member of the newsletter, and we started corresponding. So it's like everything kind of came together, which is great. And before we begin our interview, which I'm so excited about, I would like to read Alan's bio. Alan is a freelance writer who currently resides in Raleigh, North Carolina. He is a Columbia, South Carolina native, a 1995 graduate of the University of South Carolina, and a lifelong Gamecock fan. He hosts a collection of his general interest writings online at Yellow Dog Journal and his South by Southeast, a Gamecock history online newsletter, which features stories spanning decades of Gamecock athletics. And today we're going to be talking about his wonderful book, which is called The Gamecock. Oh no, my filter. My filter, no. It's called A Gamecock
Here it
Odyssey,
is.
University. Oh, yeah, perfect, perfect, perfect. A Gamecock Odyssey, University of South Carolina Sports in the Independent Era. Once again, Alan, welcome to the podcast slash show slash whatever this is going to become. Really happy to have you here.
Thank you, Kate. I'm thrilled and just want to thank you again for publicizing that event in Spartanburg and for doing what you're doing with South Carolina History Newsletter. I'm such a big fan. I was so impressed with your launch, 100 posts in 100 days. It was unbelievable amount of work and effort that went into that. But I just really admire the community you've created and what you're doing. So, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So, speaking of community, you come from an incredible community of Columbia, South Carolina, and growing up as a diehard Gamecock fan. And I kind of wanted to start us off from the very beginning. Can you tell me about your, as you described it, garnet tinged childhood? I loved that. Garnet tinged childhood and kind of your earliest memories of being a USC fan and kind of what that meant to you.
Sure. Yeah. So I was fortunate to have grown up in a college town. And I mentioned in the introduction of the book, if I'd grown up in Charlottesville or Madison or Austin, I would have been big fans of the Cavaliers or the Badgers or the Longhorns. But I grew up in Columbia. So and my dad was inclined to take me to ball games. And so spent a lot of time growing up at Williams-Brice Stadium, the old Carolina Coliseum, the basketball arena, Sarge Fry Field, the old baseball stadium. Uh, just a lot of time there. And, I think back to what it was like to be a 8, 9, 10-year-old kid going to those games. In particular, the basketball games stick out to me. And so we would park along Main Street south of the Capitol and walk down to the arena, and there it still is a tunnel that runs under Assembly Street. And so we would walk under the tunnel and come out at the Coliseum, and it was just bathed in light and this beautiful structure, sort of a mid-century gem of a facility.
Saw the photos, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and we would walk into the, to the through the glass doors and hand our tickets to the doorman. Back in that age when you had physical tickets, and
Yes.
when we walked into the place, you're just enveloped by the warmth and the buzz of the place. The pep band is playing, so you hear fight songs, and
Yeah.
there was always a big crowd, and so there was just energy. That's what I remember about being at those
Energy.
games, just the energy.
Mm.
And so we would walk into the arena, and there were banners of retired jerseys up in the rafters, and just watching the games and being around that whole experience just made such an impression on me. My first year, just real quickly, going to games was 1980-81, that
Hmm.
school year. And so think, some of the things that happened that year, fall of 1980, George Rogers wins the Heisman Trophy
Right.
for South Carolina.
So
Zam
huge.
Frederick. Yeah, yeah. Still to this day, the state's only Heisman winner. Um, Zam Frederick leads the nation in scoring in basketball. And then in the spring, the Gamecock baseball team goes to Omaha College World Series, which is the equivalent
Wow.
of the Elite Eight in or basketball. So it was, to suffice it to say, it was an amazing introduction to Gamecock
Yes.
sports. Not
Hmm.
every year has been quite like that, but still, I was hooked, and here I am, almost a half century later, and I'm still hooked.
And wearing your USC, your Carolina shirt as well.
I have to represent, yes.
Are you sitting on like special bleachers too? Are those like like seats from the arena or something you're sitting on?
You're, yeah, very observant. So these are seats from the Carolina Coliseum.
Of course they
In
are.
My wife was thrilled when I brought these home,
That's
as you
so
can
fun.
imagine. Yeah, yeah.
How did
She
you
just
get them? Was there an auction? Was there some exciting kind of fundraiser sort of a thing?
Well, so in 2014-ish, the university, so the basketball team had gone on to a new arena in 2002 or so timeframe. And so for years, the university wasn't quite sure what they were going to do with the Carolina Coliseum.
Yeah.
And so anyway, they landed on eventually that it would be a full-time practice facility.
Oh, okay.
And
Makes
so
sense.
they took out the lower bowl of retractable seats and auctioned those off to the
Oh,
public. And I
so
did not
fun.
get those in 2014, but a buddy of mine just recently put on Facebook that he needed to get rid of his.
Oh
He was
no.
cleaning out his garage, and
Oh my
they were,
gosh.
if they didn't get taken, they were going to be taken. He was going to take them to the dump. Well, I could not allow that to happen.
No. Oh my
So
gosh, no.
I
Wow.
happened to be down in Columbia, and arranged to meet him, and brought him home. So here they
Wow.
are.
That's
Much to
amazing.
the dismay of Melissa, my wife.
Oh, oh, I thought you were serious. I thought you meant that she was thrilled that they were there.
She is she was good about it. She was good about it. But
Kind place.
they're taking up space. But I couldn't allow them to go to the dump.
Right. Couldn't allow
Yeah.
that, of course.
Yeah.
So here you were, this young, young boy enveloped in this golden era of USC and USC sports, and you've become an expert on this topic. Tell me how kind of that your expertise on this topic has kind of obviously you're a full-time writer. How has this kind of enveloped, did it start as a small idea, or did you know from the very beginning that you wanted to become an expert on this? And kind of what made you decide to write this book, and how has it kind of shifted your attention over the years?
Yeah. You mentioned that I'm not a full-time writer. I do have a day job. I've been in the insurance industry for
Oh,
almost
okay.
30 years now.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and so this has just sort of been it's become a real creative outlet for me. There's not
Awesome.
a ton of creativity in my line of work. It's a great job, but
Hmm.
not a lot of creativity. And so
Yep.
this is something that I've always been interested in, always wanted to know more about. I enjoy writing. I enjoy history,
Hmm.
and over the years, I sort of had the idea that this could be maybe a project that people would be interested
Yes.
in.
Yes.
At very minimum, it was something that I was interested in researching and writing, and even if nothing
Yes.
ever came of it. And
Yes.
yeah,
Oh my
so
gosh. So how have you, and what's interesting is that like during, in preparation for this interview, I would read a passage and be like, oh my gosh, because I did not grow up in a sports family, I'll be really honest. Like I grew up playing sports. I was a, big athlete back in the day, and I played a little bit in college. I was a volleyball player. But my family didn't watch football. We didn't watch these sports. Whereas now I'm married to somebody who was raised in a sports family and watched like every
sure.
second of every game ever. And so I think you and my husband would get along well because y'all are clear, you're such sports people. So I'm reading your book and I'm just like, oh my gosh, his mind works so differently than mine because like just like the level of detail and the rebounds and the scores and this and that. So it was kind of a different world for me to read your book in the best way because it brought me into this mindset. And since moving down to South Carolina from up north, and I've got family in the South. I've been, visiting the South my whole life, specifically Sumter, South Carolina. But now
Oh,
living here is such a wonderful thing, such an honor to live here. Um, and one of the big parts of living in the South that's so much fun is football, is
yes.
sports, is the sports culture. And so how long did it kind of, now that you've become an expert on this, like when did you decide to really just commit to writing the book? And were there people out there that were like, Alan, you've got to do this? Um, and how have you, and as I was researching your book too, I would look up like, incident in 1980 or whatever, and your writing pops up. Like your writing is like SEO at the top. So you've been really gaining a reputation for this. So when did you decide to really put it to writing, to write the book?
Yeah, well, as an aside, my mom is from Sumter originally.
Oh my
So I
gosh.
spent a lot of time in Sumter as a child with my grandparents, and so we'll have to talk more about that.
We have to talk more about that. Yes.
But yeah, so I, I had always, like I said, been interested in this. One person in particular sort of brought me to this project, and it was piecemeal. I didn't have the vision, right away, but a guy by the name of Jimmy Foster.
Mm.
He was a strong forward, a basketball player. I mentioned 1980-81. That was his freshman season at South
Wow.
Carolina.
Yes.
And he was a great player, kind of a legendary player
Mm.
throughout his 4 years. He was a fan favorite. He was just sort of a blue collar guy, a
Mm.
scrapper. He was
Hmm.
from Greenville.
I saw
Um,
that in the book. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so, but off the court, he was just kind of a hot mess. He was a real character,
Yeah.
got himself into some legal trouble, and disappeared. And reappeared briefly in the late 90s in an article with the state newspaper, Bob Gillespie, and then disappeared again. And he was such a character and such a part of my experience, my early experience of going to
Mm.
games growing up,
Yeah.
that I never forgot about him. And I just always wondered, whatever happened to Jimmy?
Yeah.
And I thought
Yeah.
his experiences would have made, a great novel. Sorry, lost my earpiece. Would have made a great novel, or some
Yes.
sort of a book. And so
Yes.
I reached out to him. I found an email address for him and reached out to him, and then sort of forgot about it for a while.
Hmm.
But he eventually reached out to me like several years later.
It
But
took him years to write you back.
took him years. Took him
Wow.
years.
Okay.
But between my email and his email, I started thinking about not just Jimmy and his time at South Carolina, but about the larger era of South Carolina athletics as an independent. So they were a founding member of the ACC, left for a number of reasons in 1971,
Mm-hmm.
eventually joined the Southeastern Conference in 1991,
Mm-hmm.
exactly 20 years and a day
That's
from
crazy.
the time they left the ACC. And so I started thinking about all the things that were happening during that 20-year period. And by the time I got serious about, writing about this and researching it, it was 2017, 2018 timeframe.
Mm.
And so we're starting to approach 50 years from the time they left the ACC.
Mm-hmm.
We're starting to approach 30 years from the time they got into the SEC. So some pretty big milestone anniversaries were coming up, and I thought, this is a good time to do this. And
Yeah,
the thought occurred to
absolutely.
me the thought occurred to me that there were people in their 30s at that point who had no living memory of this era. Um,
Yes.
and so I thought it would be something that certainly Gamecock fans would be interested in, but anybody with a passing interest in the history of the ACC or the SEC or college sports. So the funny thing is, Jimmy did reach back out to me, and we had an opportunity to talk.
Mhm.
We're still in touch, um,
I love
uh,
that.
but he was a great help in certainly telling his story and also the story of the basketball program during those years.
Didn't you write that he's a truck driver now, right?
Yeah, he
Is that
lives in Northern California and drives a truck and just lives sort of a simple existence. But interesting character.
it was sad to read the part where I think I marked it down, where he describes how what they did there's some sort of 50th anniversary, there was some sort of alumni gathering and he was not invited back, and how he wanted to experience the thrill. Or sometimes when he drives through Columbia, he'll park his, correct me if I'm wrong, but he'll park his car and like kind of look at the stadium and like relive old memories. And I was just like, oh my gosh, that was very heartbreaking to read. Um,
Yeah. His is kind of a tough story. That sort of separation from the university for the sins of a young man, and the
yep,
mistakes of a young man. He's sort of been uh, shunned by the university, and to in all fairness, I have not confirmed with the university whether he was invited or not. It could be that they just couldn't find him.
maybe they
I,
couldn't.
I
Yeah.
don't know, but that was his understanding, was that his mother never received an invitation on his behalf. So
Hmm.
yeah, I know that was hurtful, and a lot of water under the bridge since those days when he had those troubles and landed the university in some hot water too. But it would be nice. Part of my motivation for telling his story was the
Hmm.
hope that maybe there could be some healing, some reconciliation, and that maybe he could
Absolutely.
be brought back into the fold in some fashion. So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And actually, on that note, can you kind of give us an overview of the Gamecock Odyssey book? Kind of there, I love your kind of table of contents, and you kind of go through like eras of this span of time that you focused on. Can you give us kind of an overview of that?
sure, yeah. Well, it starts, with the story of how and why South Carolina left the ACC,
Right.
and
Which is
without
crazy that it came down to SAT scores. I mean,
it
right?
did, it
Yeah,
did, it did.
crazy.
So, without getting too far into the weeds on that, Frank McGuire was the head basketball coach at South Carolina at the time. He had previously coached at the University of North Carolina,
Hmm.
won a national championship at UNC in 1957. But there was a lot of bad blood. By the time McGuire got to South Carolina, there was a lot of bad blood between
Mm.
McGuire and Eddie Cameron at Duke and some of his former administrators at UNC. He did not make a lot of friends
Mm.
in the ACC. He
Right.
was a New York guy,
Wow.
and kind of a brash
Yeah.
New York
Yep.
guy, and came down and won big, won a lot, and made some enemies. And so by the time he came to South Carolina, um, South Carolina had always sort of been a doormat in the
Mm,
ACC, and suddenly
right.
McGuire reestablishes his recruiting pipeline to New York
Mm,
City, starts bringing big talent in, starts
okay.
winning, starts beating Duke, beating UNC on a regular basis, and
Which wasn't supposed to happen,
it was
right?
not supposed to happen. Did not go well. Did not sit well, and so one of McGuire's prize recruits was caught up in this SAT controversy,
Mm,
which again, I won't go into too many details about that, but suffice it to say, ultimately, Mike Grosso was his name. He was the second rated recruit in the 1964-65 class, I think, behind Lou Alcindor, who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
all
Um,
right.
so it was a big deal. And then our football coach at the time, who was also our athletics director, Paul Dietzel, was having trouble retaining in-state athletes because of some SAT rules that were unique to the ACC and not any other conference. And so those two stories sort of merged,
Hmm.
and one thing led to the other, and South Carolina ultimately decided to leave the ACC, which started them down this wilderness road. This 20-year ended up being a 20-year path of independent status.
Well, speaking of the whole SAT controversy, I've marked certain passages of your book that I really loved. I hope you're okay if I read a little bit.
Oh, sure.
But and especially with kind of you say, as these matters were set against the backdrop of the civil rights movement and the integration of public schools and universities throughout the South, there was an important racial element in Dietzel's argument. Dietzel told USC President Tom Jones that it's going to be very, quote, it's going to be very difficult to explain to people around here that of all the fine black athletes playing in our newly integrated high schools, we cannot find one of them who can attend his state university. Indeed, Jones went so far as to refer to the 800 minimum as a, quote, racist regulation, end quote, and question the morality of the conference. And then going a few paragraphs ahead, the irony of South Carolina's two major universities working as outspoken advocates for Black athletes was not lost on observers throughout the conference. South Carolina had, to a greater degree than other states within the ACC footprint, fought integration throughout its history. As the only truly deep South state in the ACC, South Carolina's racial and political identity was more reflective of that region than the Mid Atlantic. That was awesome. When I read that, I was like, oh my gosh. So, anyway, I just wanted
that
to tease your
well,
book a
that
little bit
was
there, too.
well. Thank you. Well, that was a big part of it. We're talking about just on the other side of desegregation,
Hmm.
where Black athletes are able to come to USC and Clemson and other schools in the South
Yeah.
on scholarship. And the irony is they were not able to come to South Carolina in a vast majority of the cases because of this ACC rule,
Mhm.
that the ACC the SAT rule that the Atlantic
A lot
Coast
of
Conference had
acronyms
in place.
here,
A lot of
initialisms.
acronyms. So yeah, and that ultimately, more so than the heated rivalries between McGuire and the others in the ACC, the real driving factor between South Carolina getting out was Dietzel,
Mm,
head football coach and athletics director. It
mm.
was really a football decision,
Uh,
and so you can see the conflict of interest there.
yeah,
The one guy wearing
interesting.
both hats.
Right. Yeah. So then take us into kind of the next era. You talk about, was what was next? The mascots? Oh, build it and they will come. This was so fun. Tell us a little bit about the facilities era and like modernizing things.
Yeah, yeah, it was, so it was an eventful era, um, late 60s, early 70s, leading into this wilderness period. Coach Dietzel was a great success as athletics director in his leadership on the facilities front. So South Carolina, I mentioned earlier, had always sort of been a doormat in
Yes.
the ACC. Had not won a lot, but they decided to make an investment, and they invested in coaches with Frank McGuire, um, Paul Dietzel. Later
Hmm.
on, they brought in New York Yankees legend Bobby Richardson to take over the
That's
baseball
right.
program, who was a Sumter
Yeah.
native.
Mm.
Um, and so they made a massive investment in coaches and then facilities, and they built the Carolina Coliseum in 1968, which at the time was the largest basketball facility, the basketball arena in the Southeast,
Mm.
one seat larger than Reynolds Coliseum in Raleigh.
I saw that kind of a basketball arms race of sorts. That was so funny. One
Yes,
seat bigger.
yes, and then they built the spring sports complex and athletic dormitories, a new baseball facility. They expanded Williams-Brice Stadium. It used to be Carolina Stadium. They got a large donation from the Williams-Brice family, who was also from Sumter. Sumter, it seems to be a
Wait,
reoccurring
what's going
theme.
on with Sumter? I know. That's so interesting.
I know, and there Sumter is also the Gamecocks, their high school team. But
Well, Sumter, it's named after the founding father, Sumter. What was Sumter's first name again? How can
Thomas
I forget? Thomas. Yeah.
Thomas Sumter,
There you
Revolutionary
go.
War hero, the Gamecock. That's
Of
right.
course. Yes.
So yeah, there was some fun stories about facilities. The third chapter kind of goes into the early wilderness years,
Yes.
where South Carolina now finds themselves out of the ACC and sort of struggling to make their way in that new world, particularly the basketball program.
Is this
Um,
the era of the chicken curse?
I do go into that in the legends, logos, mascots chapter.
Oh, that
Yes,
was I
that
think
was
that
a
was my
thing.
favorite chapter. Yeah. And hold on, I have a section from your book where people were so superstitious that the booster president, Floyd Bowie Jr., arranged for a witch doctor to come to campus, and a small crowd gathered to watch the brief ritual. And when it was finished, Thibaut, the witch doctor, declared, "Curse is gone. We will be victorious. Call me if it doesn't work, but we will win." And Thibaut cited a 98.5% success rate for lifting curses. It's hard to argue with a witch doctor who uses metrics to track performance. Thibaut likely changed his number, however, as USC began the 1992 season 0-5, and head coach Sparky Woods had to quell a growing player revolt. Curses are stubborn things. That made me laugh. Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
How
an
did you find
exorcism,
out about that? How did you even find out? Like, did you interview Floyd Bowie Jr.? How did you find out
I
about it?
remembered that. I remembered that. So, I was able to go back and find those newspaper clippings. I could not catch up with Floyd Bowie Jr., but I just, researching the newspaper clippings from those times, I'd remembered that there was this exorcism, which is just crazy,
Yeah.
right? Right outside the gates of Williams-Brice Stadium the day before their first SEC football game. And so,
Oh,
yeah, that's how that, and part of it was tongue in cheek for sure. It was kind of fun. It was kind
yeah,
of a
that is kind of
stunt,
fun.
but people did believe that there was a chicken curse. South Carolina started their bowl history 0-8. They didn't go to a lot of bowls to begin with,
Hmm.
and then they lost their first eight. There's a whole litany of things that people point to that are hard to hard to explain in any other way than this chicken curse. So
The chicken curse. And then,
yes,
and I know one of the explanations you gave, um, which was so interesting. You and I have a fascination with Ben Tillman, South Carolina
yes,
historical figure. The chicken curse entered popular culture in South Carolina, and many have speculated about its origins. One theory goes back to Pitchfork Ben Tillman, former U.S. Senator and South Carolina governor, who was instrumental in the establishment of Clemson University. Legend holds that Tillman, indignant after the state legislature blocked his initial efforts as governor to fund a new agricultural institution, drove a pitchfork into the ground on the USC horseshoe, which sits a stone's throw from the State House, he reportedly declared that a curse would befall the University of South Carolina henceforth. That is so crazy.
I don't know that that's the actual story, but it's kind of fun to think about.
Yes.
And he was a character for sure, and did not was not fond of the University of South Carolina. Was
Mm-mm.
not one of the greatest advocates for the University of South Carolina over the years.
Can you talk about I mean, obviously we're talking more in the modern era, but can you talk a little bit about why he didn't like USC then South Carolina College? It's kind of like a kind of an interesting tidbit you go into in the book.
Yeah, so he was from Edgefield County, western part of the state. Agricultural area, part of the state. They called him the agricultural Moses, and he was an advocate for his people, and
Yes.
sort of skewered the political class and the bourbon Republicans,
Mhm.
the bourbon
Democrats.
Democrats rather. Yes, yes, that's all switched sides
I
now,
know
but
now
the
it's
the
all
bourbon
switched. I know.
Democrats. Yeah, yeah, but he was a an outspoken critic of that sort of ruling class, and what really advocated for agricultural education at the University of South Carolina, or wanted to see that, and the
Mm,
university made some offerings, in that regard, which he thought were pathetic, not nearly enough. And
right.
so when he became governor, he reallocated substantial funds from University of South Carolina to Clemson College, and became a major benefactor in that way. Through his position as governor. So, there are a lot of there's a lot of history between that rivalry between the University of South Carolina and
Yes.
Clemson, and a lot of it goes back to that antipathy that Pitchfork Ben Tillman had towards the
Right.
university.
Because to him, didn't it kind of represent this elitist institution where, all the sons of the urban Democrats went, and it was kind of a machine for this kind of elite group that he was not a part of.
That's right.
Would you say?
That's
Mhm.
exactly right. He, besides the University of South Carolina, he sort of had it in for the Citadel too. He called it a dude factory.
Oh
And
yeah, I remember reading that Dude Factory.
yeah,
It's
so he sort of reveled in sticking it to that established ruling class, and then later became part of that ruling class himself, ironically.
ironically, absolutely. And I know it's not uh in this kind of era that you focus on in the book, but I know you wrote an article about this and I think you've sent me it as well about the 19 speaking of the rivalry between USC and Clemson, which everyone is so like interested in, of course. Can you talk a little bit about the 1902 um would you call it a riot? Would you call it an almost insurrection? Like what would we call it between them?
Yeah, I
Can you
guess
tell
you
us a
would.
little bit about that? Because that's such an incredible story that almost turned into something truly horrific.
That's one of the really remarkable chapters of that long rivalry. I would call it probably an almost riot, an
Almost
almost
riot.
a near armed insurrection, maybe. But
Yeah.
this was 1902. So Carolina and Clemson had been playing each other for 4 or 5 years, and it was a young rivalry, but already pretty heated.
Hmm.
Clemson at that time was a military college, and so at that time, and up until 1959, every game was played on Thursday of State Fair Week in Columbia, on the campus of the university, or on the state fairgrounds at the stadium there. And so it was Big Thursday. And it was a huge rivalry matchup. Going back to 1902, Clemson had dominated that
Mm.
the rivalry almost from the get go. Carolina won the first game. Clemson
Hmm.
won the next three, four games, I think.
Oh,
But
okay.
by 1902, Carolina managed to finally win again, and they beat Clemson
Hmm.
in that 1902 game. Well, as part of the state fair and some of the events around the state fair, uh, on Friday after the big Thursday game, there was a parade, and
Hmm.
uh, and so the cadets from Clemson were there. The Carolina students and football players were part of it as well, and the winning team sort of got to, that was their opportunity to sort of show off
Hmm.
and celebrate and stick it to the rivals a little bit.
Hmm.
Well, there was the story goes, there was a cigar shop on Main Street. And in the window of this cigar shop, there was a transparency or a drawing of this crowing gamecock standing over this tiger, this prostrate tiger. And so the USC students, grabbed this transparency out of the window and paraded it up Main Street, much to the irritation of the Clemson Corps cadets. Um, the parade ended. USC students made their way back to the horseshoe. And lo and behold, word got around that the Corps cadets from Clemson were headed towards the horseshoe, bayonets drawn. And
That's
so this
crazy that they were students and they had bayonets.
the bayonets.
1902. Yeah.
Yes,
Wow.
yes, they did. Different era.
Hmm.
And so this ragtag assembly of Carolina students formed to defend the horseshoe. And they've got
Oh.
sticks, and a couple guys have revolvers, and but the rocks. They're grabbing whatever they can to defend the horseshoe from this military unit, and so uh, the Corps cadets gets to the edge of the horseshoe. Um, Ultimately, cooler heads prevail. There was no armed conflict, but it came pretty darn close to
Yeah.
actual armed conflict at the gates of the horseshoe.
And did you say how many of the cadets were there? Was it 400, did you
Four
say?
seems like it was 400,
It was a
maybe.
couple hundred
Yeah.
against this kind of ragtag group of USC, but USC students, but oh my gosh, that would have been horrible. And then didn't was weren't things so heated that they suspended the annual games between both schools for was it 5 years?
For a number of years,
Yeah.
4 or 5 years. Yeah, I think it was 1906 when they started playing again. So yeah, cool. Yeah, they needed to just tap the brakes and let things cool off a little bit.
Now, do you go to the annual Clemson USC game yourself every year? Do you make the trek?
I don't. I've been to a number of them. I've been to a number of Carolina Clemson games, but I'm not a season ticket holder. I live here in Raleigh now, so I don't get down to as many games as I would like to. But the games that I've been to, and I've been to a number in Columbia and a number in Clemson. Um, it is intense. It is an intense rivalry, and it's a small state with no pro sports. The
Yeah.
Panthers now, over in Charlotte, so there is sort of a close team. But when I grew up, there was no pro sports team really anywhere close, and so college football was everything,
Everything.
uh, everything. And so that was just a massive part of the sort of the fabric of the culture of the state, that rivalry. And you
Mhm.
pick sides. You learn pretty quickly. You have to pick sides when you move to South Carolina, which you may have already.
Well, listen, I work, so I also have a 9 to 5 job, and this is my passion outside of work. And I guess you and I haven't even really shared. Like, I know you mentioned earlier you're in insurance, which is awesome. And by day, I'm a marketing professional. And so two of my bosses actually have box seats at Clemson games. They're that huge of
Okay.
fans.
Yeah.
And so
Big
I have been
boosters.
invited this fall to attend a Clemson game in the VIP box, which I
Nice.
am so excited about. But I feel like it's only fair. I need to also go to a USC game this season so I can feel the energy from both sides. and
you
see how
have
it
to
goes.
experience both. And in all seriousness, Clemson it's a cool place. It's a great setting.
Yes,
Um,
it's beautiful.
I have a hard time with orange, with the color orange, but I will say that it's a beautiful place. It's a great campus. You'll enjoy your time there. But definitely come on down to Columbia, and
I know.
that's a great experience as well.
And
So
I have to walk the historic horseshoe now that I've done research
yes,
into those beautiful buildings and what they meant and the just the early history of USC when it was South Carolina College. I really want to kind of delve into more. But anyway, redirecting us back to the eras. We were I don't know if we get to we're into the wilderness, the post ACC world. Yes, we're in the wilderness. The chicken
yes.
curse is upon us. And then you talk about the legends, logos, mascots, and traditions, which that's my favorite chapter. I wanted to
Okay.
tell you the early photographs of the various mascots. The earliest mascot, what was his name again? Was it Snapper? What was it? It had an
Oh
S word.
gosh.
What was it again? I wrote it
There
down here.
there were a number. So there was the Gamecock, which
Span.
was
Spanny?
Span was the student who wore the costume.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Who wore the costume? And then
Yeah,
Waldo.
Waldo, interesting looking guy.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh my God.
pretty rudimentary costumes, those early costumes. It really got serious in the late 70s, with the whole Muppets craze.
Oh, yeah. Good
And
point.
San Diego Chicken came along and the Philly
Oh,
Fanatic. And so mascots sort of became a thing.
hmm.
And South Carolina followed suit. First, there was Big Spur, which was this
Yes.
7 foot tall costume, really unwieldy, big tail feathers, kind of
I,
creepy looking.
yeah,
But his costume was sort of falling apart, and
it
he
wasn't very high quality.
couldn't move very well. Yeah, and so Linda Singer, who was the cheerleader coach at the
Mm,
time, decided she wanted a more huggable, lovable bird
yes.
and had the cocky costume manufactured, which debuted, I believe, at the homecoming game in 1980 against
Mm,
Cincinnati.
oh my
And
gosh.
he was not well received. It was not well received.
Yeah, didn't people think he looked pregnant or something?
They did not think he looked dignified. Yeah,
Yeah.
pregnant. He was sort of big through the middle, and and so that he did not get a warm reception. But eventually, he worked basketball games and became kind of a fixture at baseball games. Went on
Hmm.
to the College World Series in Omaha and made a big impression out there. And then by the '81 season, I guess he sort of ingratiated himself. He fans warmed up, and from that point on, he's just been an icon really at USC, and a really fun part of game day.
I mean,
So
wouldn't he kind of do things that were kind of mischievous? Like, wouldn't he like steal things from people? Didn't he? I think I remember he stole a state trooper's hat and handcuffs and he ran away with them or something.
yes, yes, only cocky could get away with that. He would, at baseball games, he would pull out an eye chart for the umpire. He would, during rain
Funny.
delays, he would trot out to the pitcher's mound under this comically small umbrella, and then when the rain delay was over, he would put on big sunglasses. So he was always just involved in these antics that would get the crowd involved. And yeah, I remember growing up, he was kind of new when I was a kid, and we just loved him. He came to our school one time, and kids just mauled him. I don't know. It's hard to believe he even got out of there in one piece,
So
but
cute.
kids absolutely love Cocky, and he's just become such an iconic part of the university. There's a statue now at Gibbs Green on
Oh,
campus.
I love that.
People do the selfie thing and everything, so it's a big deal.
I love that. And I love the traditions that were built in this era. I had never heard of the Cockaboose Railroad before. Like, is that still going? I mean, it sounds like people are still like that's still going,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's a sort of an iconic tradition that came along during this era. Yeah, it is absolutely still there. People own, buy these. They go on, they rarely go on sale, but when they do, they go for hundreds of dollars, and it's a
Hundreds of thousands
literal,
of dollars.
yeah, hundreds of thousands. I mean,
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands. It's a literal caboose. So it's a really small little thing, but people decorate. They renovate them with granite countertops and nice finishes and walnut paneling. I mean, they really go all out to decorate and personalize these things, and it's become just a huge draw and sort of a tailgating icon, not just for South Carolina, but across college football. People know about
Mm.
the cockabooses, so it's a
And
big
can you
deal.
describe like how that even came to be and buying the spur and all that? It's so interesting.
Yeah, yeah. There was an abandoned railroad spur behind Williams-Brice that just sort of sat there
Mm.
unused for decades. And these two really smart guys decided, hey, wouldn't it be great if we bought a bunch of cabooses, 22, I think is what they ended up with,
Mm.
painted them garnet, and sold them to people, and people can use them for tailgating.
Such a good
And so
idea.
this was 1989, I guess, the first year, and that's they sold out within days, and it just became this massive cultural phenomena at South Carolina. And so if you go to a game, that is a must. You have to go see the
I have
Cockaboose
to at
Railroad.
least see what's going on. I mean, have you partied in one of these before?
I have never actually been in a cockaboose myself, but so we all have life goals. That's one thing I
Well,
would like to do. Yeah,
Alan Piercy's life goals, cockaboose on
right,
top. Love that.
exactly.
Okay, so here we are, the chicken curse, the the identity of the team, cocky, all these kind of things are coming together. And then the start of chapter 5 was a national power emerges. So how does USC get out of this rut they're in?
So that's all about baseball. That's the baseball chapter, and we talked a little bit about Bobby Richardson, Sumter native, New York Yankees legend.
Mm,
Um, he came to South Carolina and really is considered the father of Gamecock baseball.
mm,
South Carolina baseball started in 1892, and by 1969, the year before Coach Richardson gets there, they had almost a 500 record, so almost dead even, just sort
that
of
even.
mediocre program over the years.
Mm,
Um, Coach Richardson comes in, and by 1974, has Carolina in their first NCAA tournament. And by the following year, 1975, has them in Omaha for the College World Series for the first
mm,
time ever. They make it all the way to the national championship game where
wow.
they lost to Texas, but still, that sort of set the standard for Gamecock baseball. He left a year later. June Raines came in, who had been an
Hmm.
assistant previously. Coach Raines, in his first season, 1977, takes the Gamecocks right back to the College World Series, goes back
Mm,
to the final championship, the championship game, and comes up short again. But again, 2 out of 3 seasons, Carolina was playing for a national championship. And so that sort
right.
of elevated the status of the program on the national level. And Coach Raines was there for 20 years, had a lot of success, won a lot of ball games, and then Coach Tanner comes in, Coach Ray
Hmm.
Tanner, who's our athletics director now, and just had unprecedented success.
Mm,
Wins 2 national championships consecutive back to back. This
yep.
is this is after this era that I'm writing about, but
Mm,
Coach Richardson and Coach Raines, who were there during this Gamecock Odyssey era,
yeah.
really sort of set the stage for the success that Coach Tanner had, and so that's the baseball chapter.
Love that. And then you take us into Pullets, Chicks, and Lady Gamecocks. Tell us about that chapter.
That's the women's sports chapter, and I will say. by way of an asterisk, it's just Gamecocks now. It's not Lady
Yes.
Gamecocks. Yeah, and
Oh,
so
is it?
that
Oh, okay.
yeah. But at the time, during this era, it was the Chicks and then the Lady Gamecocks, and so that's just sort of the way things were back then. It was a different era.
Yeah.
Women's sports were still fairly new. Title
Hmm.
IX happens in 1974, I think, which opens the
Hmm.
door to women's sports going from club level competition to varsity status,
Right.
and which opened tremendous opportunity for female athletes, and so this chapter is really primarily about the women's basketball program
Hmm.
and the success they had under a coach by the name of Pam Parsons, and
Yes.
also some controversy that arose and
Yes.
a scandal that arose, but then beyond Pam Parsons, some continued success under Nancy Wilson, who was a fantastic coach, and then years and years after this era, of course, Coach Staley comes along and builds the program into what it is now. But a lot of people don't know that South Carolina women's basketball was kind of a big deal years ago,
Back in
late
the day.
70s, yeah, late 70s, early 80s. They had a lot of success. They were sort of a national contender for a brief period of time before the unfortunate incident with Coach Parsons.
Yeah, I had no idea about Pam Parsons, and this picture in the book that you feature of the 1980-81 USC Women's Basketball Media Guide. Um, I'll describe it. It's Coach Parsons with this. She does not look like an athletic coach necessarily. She has this beautiful dress on. She's wearing like a beautiful necklace, and she's looking at a rooster in the or gamecock in the hedges, and it's just sort of like, huh, interesting. And then I had no idea about the scandal involving her having a relationship with a player, and oh
Yeah,
my goodness, in that day and age, that would, wow. I mean,
yeah,
that got national media attention, didn't it?
it did in the form of a Sports Illustrated
Right.
expose. So you're thinking about this is 1984 when all this comes out. Um, so early to mid 80s, deep South, very conservative culture.
Mhm.
The scandal, interestingly enough, the really scandalous thing back then
Yeah.
was the relationship. Not so much the power imbalance, and
Yeah.
the abuse of power
Yeah.
aspect, which would be a much bigger story today.
Today.
Back then, it was more about the actual relationship itself.
Yeah. Yeah, the two women were in a relationship
Yeah,
together. Wow.
yeah.
Um, by the way, how excited were you that the Dawn Staley and her team won this year? Like, where were you when it happened? Were you at a sports bar? Like, were you with other USC people? Because that was so exciting.
Yeah, it was amazing. 36-0, I think. Melissa, my wife, has become a big Gamecock fan, and we watch literally every ball game. So we were here at the house in Raleigh
Mm.
watching. We had gotten down to a couple of games in Columbia. We went to the Carolina Duke game in Durham. Anytime they're anywhere near here, we go. But
So fun.
so we'd seen a number of games and watched every single one of them on television, and it was a thrill. It was a thrill just to see that team that had lost their entire starting five the year before.
Insane.
Um, and you think, okay, well, this is probably going to be a little bit of a rebuilding year,
Hmm.
and for them to do what they did was just absolutely phenomenal and so much fun.
Yeah, and I really appreciated when my husband and I were watching, I really appreciated that she got up there and she acknowledged the other team so graciously, and particularly Caitlin Clark, and
Yeah.
just it was a really kind of rousing speech she gave, and so I really loved that. Um,
We're so fortunate to have her at South Carolina.
yeah,
Just can't say enough about Coach Staley. I hope she stays another 16 years.
yeah,
She's been so good for not just the university, not just for that program, but the university as a whole, city of
Mhm.
Columbia, the state. She's just been wonderful.
Sorry, that's my Google. Someone's at my front door. Someone else will get it. Did you hear that?
I did.
Did
I
you?
did.
You're
Yeah.
like, what is that? Okay, so then after that chapter in women's sports, we go to Any Port in a Storm. USC joins the Metro Conference. Tell us a bit about this era.
Yeah. So by the early 80s, it had become increasingly evident that in the major independent status was not sustainable from a financial standpoint because television had become a big factor by this time. Oh, you're fine. Do you need to?
Keep going. No, it's fine.
Okay, okay. Television had ESPN had come along in the late 70s, and by the early 80s, conferences have these lucrative television packages.
Yeah.
Independent schools are also not getting invitations to the NCAA tournament as often. They're being
Mm,
passed over in favor of conference schools. And so it became increasingly evident that USC needed to find a conference home. They wanted a all sports conference home. There was a lot of sort of behind the scenes conversations between USC officials and ACC officials about the possibility of returning to the
like coming back.
ACC.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the mid to late 70s. But by 1978, that sort of fizzled out. Georgia Tech was invited to sort of take South Carolina's place as the eighth member of the ACC.
Oh, okay.
So it did not seem like the ACC was going to be an option. The SEC was not really looking to expand at the time,
Mm,
and no other conference really made sense. And so this Metro Conference option came along, which was a all sports other than football
mm,
conference, and it really gave South Carolina an opportunity to sort of uh, find that stability that they needed,
mm.
certainly in basketball. Um, because of the conference tournament, it gave them an opportunity for an automatic bid to the NCAA tournament,
Oh,
not just
okay.
in basketball, but in other sports as well, that they
Mm,
did not have as an independent. And so, uh, the bigger thing that did is it sort of enabled South Carolina to right the ship administratively, get their ducks in a row,
mm.
get their house in
Okay.
order, so that a few years later, when the ACC and the SEC did begin to talk about expansion, South
Hmm.
Carolina was in a better place to be considered for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So it was
Wow.
sort of it wasn't a great fit. It was kind of like I said, any port in a storm. They needed a conference home at the time, and that was the option that was available to
I'm still learning about all these conferences. It's like my husband is like every fall. It's like he becomes my sports professor, and I know what's going on when I watch football, but he still has to help me like figure out like what does this play mean? Because to me, it just looks like a bunch of people, ramming together. And he's like, look here, look there. And then I'm like, what are these conferences? Like, where
them.
are they? What's going
Hey,
on?
believe me, we're all kind of figuring things out right now because things have changed so much in the last several years with name, image, and likeness, and the transfer
Oh,
portal, and
yeah.
conference realignment is still going strong. So we're all trying to figure it out.
Oh my gosh. And then we go into, I like the name of this chapter, Good Times and Bad Times. Heisman. Is it Heisman or Heisman?
Heisman, yeah,
Heisman, Heisen, and Losing Lows. Tell us about this chapter.
yeah. So that chapter is really about early 80s. We talked a little bit about George Rogers winning the Heisman Trophy,
Oh yeah.
and that 1980, 81 year was Zam Frederick, and the baseball team was having a lot of success going to Omaha on a pretty regular basis. So there was some good times. There were also some bad times too. There was a period, a 3-year period where South Carolina had 3 football coaches in 3 seasons. A lot of sort of tumultuous time. Jim
Mm,
Carlin, who succeeded um, Paul Dietzel as athletics director and head football coach. Um, Sort of, he was a strong personality, kind of a caustic personality. He had,
Mm,
by 1981, he had made some enemies, um, and had sort of established a pattern of weak finishes
mm,
to the season. In 1981, he ends up on a 3-game losing streak that gave the board sort of the impetus they needed to get rid of Carlin. They were also looking to separate the athletics director and head football coach positions. And so
right.
anyway, Richard Bell comes in for one season only. They go 4-7. He's dismissed. Uh, Joe Morrison comes in, and
Mm,
and that is sort of the setting the stage for the next chapter, the Man in Black chapter. But it was a lot of turmoil back then, just administratively, as they were looking to again separate the football coach and athletics director positions.
mhm,
Um, there were factions between fans and administrators and board of trustees members,
hmm,
people that were pro Frank McGuire and pro Jim Carlin
mm,
factions. It was kind of a mess, honestly.
mm.
It was just a sort of an ugly era in a lot of ways, but some good things happened as well. So I dive into a little bit of all of that.
Well, speaking of the good things, I did mark a chapter about George Rogers here. I wanted to read it. But more than the records, the awards, the accolades, what Rogers meant to the University of South Carolina and its fans was a matter of pride and legitimacy. He represented a program mired in mediocrity throughout its football history and showed that the University of South Carolina could compete on par with the blue bloods of college football. So well worded. He was the lovingly adopted son of a small, poor state with a lurid history of racial strife and discrimination, demonstrating the power of sport to transcend even the most deeply rooted social ills. He was the first Black player from the Deep South to win the Heisman, soon to be followed by Georgia's Walker and Auburn's Bo Jackson, among others. Alan, you're such a good writer. Oh,
You're
so
kind.
good.
Thank you.
I love that. Just the symbolism of what that meant on so many different levels. Love that. Did you ever meet George Rogers?
I have met Big George, that they call him. He's such a great guy and a great ambassador for the university. He actually works for the university as an ambassador,
Oh,
um,
good.
and so he's just a beloved figure at USC. Great guy, just a gregarious personality, sort of bigger
Oh.
than life. So
Does he come to all the games? Like, is he often there?
he is there every home game with his Heisman Trophy, taking pictures with fans and signing pictures. And that's sort of one of his mechanisms for raising money for his George Rogers Foundation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which provides assistance for first generation college students.
Oh, that's
So
awesome.
yeah,
Love it.
he's done a lot of great things. So huge fan.
Huge fan. Oh, yeah. And so you mentioned the Man in Black. Take us into that era now.
Joe Morrison was sort of this cowboy figure, the Man in Black. He wore all black on the sidelines, dark aviator sunglasses.
Mm.
He smoked on the sidelines. He would sort of hide it. He would cup the cigarette, but he was just sort of this cowboy-like figure that he came from. He's a Tennessee native, but he came from New Mexico. So he came from out west. He wore cowboy boots. Uh, and he had this sort of, uh, low key, unassuming, all shucks sort of personalities. And people loved him. Carolina was coming off, a series of 14 years with Paul Dietzel and Jim Carlin, who they were athletics directors in addition to being football coaches. They sort of had these ambitions beyond football, political ambitions within the administration,
Hmm.
and and so Joe Morrison comes along after that era, and all he wants to do is coach football. And he was an NFL legend. He played 14 seasons, I believe, with the New York Giants.
Hmm.
Was kind of a legend. His number had been retired by the Giants, and so
Wow.
he he was just sort of a balm, I think, to USC fans. Just his approach to the game, his low key personality. He had a great sense of humor, but he also had this sort of man in black persona that
Mm.
people just fell in love with. And probably more important than all of that, he won. And
He won.
yeah, his
Yep.
second season was and we're coming up on 40 years now since that 1984 season. They
Yeah.
went 10-2, were ranked as high as number two in the nation at one point during the season,
Wow.
and that was the Carolina's first ever 10-win season in program history.
Mm.
Had a shot at a national championship until their loss to Navy, which
Hmm.
still haunts Gamecock fans old enough to remember.
Uh,
But people absolutely loved Joe Morrison.
and just to be clear, when you say he was a balm to USC, you mean a BALM, not a BOMB, correct?
Well, a little bit of
Or maybe
both.
both.
He was a balm, BALM, early on, and then later on in his tenure, unfortunately, there was another scandal that ended up on the pages of Sports Illustrated, a steroid
Yep.
scandal, uh,
Yes.
which uh, which was a tough thing for USC. Almost kept South Carolina out of the SEC a few
Right.
years later because of an NCAA probation that came along as a result of that. But
So
people
he was both. He was a
he
balm
was
and then a
both.
bomb.
He was, he was just, it was a classic human story. They're good things, they're bad things. The thing about Joe Morrison, he had a child out of wedlock. He was a smoker. Again, this, conservative South of the
Yeah.
mid to late 1980s,
Yeah.
things that would have ended the careers of lots of people. Uh,
Yes.
People overlook that with Joe Morrison.
Yeah.
They loved him. It made him more human, more relatable,
Mm.
and so he was just I talk about a beloved figure. He was really a beloved figure at South Carolina. Um, Unfortunately, he died.
Hmm.
He had a massive heart attack, actually playing racquetball at a court underneath the west stands of Williams-Brice Stadium um,
Mm.
in February of '89. So after his final season of '88, and so that was the end of that era. But it was an exciting era, a really colorful era, and he put some great teams on the field.
Do you remember watching him? Like, would you go to the games and watch him in person? And was there just the sort of kind of celebrity aura around him? Could you feel it?
Oh yeah, yeah. There was almost this sort of Johnny Cash outlaw persona
Oh,
about him. Between
cool.
the black garb and the cowboy boots and the
Yeah.
aviator sunglasses, and he just had this aura, this presence about him that, and it made it made South Carolina football cool
Yeah.
for maybe the first time ever. He really
Yeah.
brought a swagger
Swagger.
to South
Hmm.
Carolina football.
This is kind of reminding me of last season's football season when I forget his name, but the guy who the coach of, is it Oregon, who calls himself Prime Time or something? What?
Colorado, Deion
Yeah,
Sanders.
Colorado. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, Deion Sanders and like the cool glasses and the whole allure and just, when are we oh, and then of course, who's the coach of the LSU women's basketball team? What's her
Mulkey,
name?
Kim
Yeah,
Mulkey.
her
Yeah,
and her kind of garb she wears. There's when your team is, and her team is good. I know Dion's Colorado, like it started on a high and then fizzled out. But when there's an allure around the coach, it's kind of you don't really see that much. But when they've got like the garb and the glasses, It's really
Yeah.
fun. It can be very
Yeah,
fun.
it is. It is. And he had this air of confidence about him, quiet confidence, but he imparted that to his team. And you could just see, even in his first season, 1983, they went 5-6 that year. So it was a losing season. And at one point, they were 6 games in, they were 3-3, and it was the same record that they had had under Richard Bell the prior year in 1982. But fans could just sense
Mm,
a difference in the team, the way they carried themselves, the confidence that they were playing with, and it made it fun for fans.
yes.
And of course the winning helped too, right?
The winning,
The
right.
winning always helps, but his personality was just caught on, and it became he set fashion trends. South Carolina, the
Really?
garnet and black. Garnet had always been the primary color.
Right.
Uh, Garnet or black was just a trim color, but they started wearing garnet, or excuse me, black jerseys. Um,
Mm,
the Clemson game
because of
in
him?
'83 because of him. Yeah, and then other sports picked up on that, and to this day,
Wow.
black is sort of a an alternate primary color.
I
And
didn't know
so,
that. Oh
yeah,
my gosh. That's
yeah,
so interesting. And
he was
can
a
you remind me,
trendsetter.
can you remind me, was he from up north?
He was from Lima, Ohio, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
Um, I
And
believe that's the name of the town.
how did he but he had played it for the New York Giants, you said. How did he but he was, because he was winning, of course, and he kind of had this persona, like, was there anything in, him coming down to South Carolina, was there any kind of like culture shift for him, or he just fit right in right away? Or maybe we'll never know.
I think he fit right in. He had spent some time at Tennessee Chattanooga. That was his first coaching stop, and in fact, I mentioned he had a pretty good sense of humor. He said one time about his coaching stops at UT Chattanooga, and then he went to New Mexico. He said it took me 5 years to learn how to spell Chattanooga, and then we moved to Albuquerque.
Oh
so,
my God.
so he,
Ooh.
I think he fit right in. He loved South Carolina, I think, as much as South Carolina people loved him.
Loved him.
He loved the culture, and so I think it was an easy transition for him.
Got it. So then the next chapter, chapter 10, is the backside of the storm, football scandal and basketball probation mar late 80s success. Tell us about this era.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about Jimmy Foster and the trouble he got in, the borrowed car that was not returned,
Yes.
which led to uh, some reporting around that. He was arrested and charged in absentia because he was playing professional basketball over in Australia.
Australia, right.
Yeah, yeah, and so when reports of that came out, reporters got in touch with him over in Australia, and he said, "Look, yeah, that happened, but this was going on the entire time I was at South Carolina, which
Mhm.
in an age before name, image, and likeness, athletes couldn't have benefits like loaner cars and cash
Hotel
that he was
rooms
getting,
and
hotel rooms,
yeah.
and some of the benefits that he was enjoying. And he said, look, I don't want to be the one to tell all these stories, but if I go down for some of this, I'm bringing some people with me.
Down with
And
me.
yeah, yeah. And so he unleashed a number of different scandals, one of which caught the attention of the NCAA. There was investigation that ended in probation for the basketball team, the basketball program. And then a few years later, the steroid scandal breaks
Mm.
while South Carolina was still on probation for basketball. So now you have sort
Oh,
of repeat offender
right.
situation.
Status. Yeah.
There was a lot of hand wringing around that, not knowing what the NCAA might do
Right.
uh, about that. And on top of that, the NCAA had never investigated, um, anything to do with steroids or drugs before. So it was a kind of a
Oh,
novel case.
novel thing. Huh.
Novelty breeds terror, as one attorney said. And
Yeah.
so all this is taking place while the USC is trying to get into an all sports conference.
Mm.
By this time, 1990-ish,
Mhm.
the SEC and the ACC had decided they were going to expand. And so South Carolina desperately is trying to get some traction there. Can't really do much about any of it until the NCAA uh, thing is resolved. And ultimately it was. And I think a lot of it has to do with how cooperative South
Mm.
Carolina was. They conducted their own internal investigation, shared those results with the NCAA.
Wow.
Ultimately, it ended up with just essentially a slap on the wrist, and
Oh,
so
okay.
they were able to put that behind them and pursue this conference affiliation, and so, but that there was a lot of drama behind that,
Oh my
and
gosh.
so that sort of leads into the final chapter about joining the SEC, but. Yeah, interesting developments just around the NCAA probations, the multiple NCAA probations, more coaching, upheaval during that time. So it continues to sort of be a wilderness path that the university is on.
And then it finally comes to a new world order, like you said, South Carolina and the Southeastern Conference. Do you think it's been a good thing for USC?
Unquestionably, it's been a
Yeah.
phenomenal thing, not just for USC, but for the city of Columbia,
Yes.
um, the state of South Carolina. Just strictly from a financial standpoint, it has
Mm.
been a godsend for South Carolina.
Yeah.
You look at another school who was a major independent during that era, West Virginia,
Yeah.
who was not fortunate enough to get into the ACC or the SEC
Mm.
and ended up in the Big East for a little while. And then finally, they ended up in the Big 12, which is really a Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas based conference.
Okay.
And so it's really ill-fitting
Yeah.
geographically,
It
culturally,
makes no sense. Yeah.
but it was, we talked about any port in a storm. That was sort of any port in a storm
To
for
be
West
strong,
Virginia.
healthy, and flexible.
Sorry. Did you hear that? Did you hear what it said?
I heard something flexible.
So every night, this is so funny. Every night, our family, we have a Google Nest and it sends out an alarm that says at 8 o'clock, it says, stretch to be strong, healthy, and flexible.
That's good advice,
It's a
actually.
reminder to stretch. And I'm like, that is so funny that anyway. Thank you for bearing with the doorbell and now the Google Home.
Oh, I'm just waiting for a dog or a cat to walk in anytime now.
So
So
cute.
we had those distractions, but no, it's all
Where were
good.
we?
But
Oh, the ill-fitting West Virginia,
yeah, West
ill-fit.
Virginia. So if if things had not worked out the way they did for South Carolina very well could have been in a position like that, and it
Yeah.
was definitely not a given. It was kind of a musical chairs situation. You
Hmm.
had two openings, one in the SEC after they had invited Arkansas to be the 11th member. They were going to invite one more member, and then the ACC was going to expand by one. So you had three teams: South Carolina, University of Miami, and Florida State,
Mm.
who were vying for those two open spots. And in a lot of ways, Florida State and Miami were much more prestigious
Yeah.
from a football standpoint. But ultimately, the FSU chose the ACC.
Mm.
Miami was never a really great fit anyway. They were sort of a small private college in a big city, not
Mm.
really consistent with the other SEC schools. So ultimately, South Carolina got in. It was a beautiful day when that happened, and it's been a good ride. 34 years. It's hard to believe it's been 34 years,
Yeah.
but the competition has been, um, it's tough. It's tough sledding in the SEC,
Yeah.
but I do think certainly it's been a great thing for the university.
Yeah, and speaking of the financial piece, I was blown away by some of these numbers you share in the book. By 2016, Nike, Under Armour, and Adidas pumped more than 300 million into athletics departments. That's not that long ago. In 2013, South Carolina signed a 10-year, $71.5 million deal with Under Armour, which was the seventh most valuable deal in college athletics at the time and second highest in the SEC. In the 2016-17 fiscal year, South Carolina earned 8.5 million from this deal, including 4.5 million in equipment and apparel and 4 million in cash. A short time later, Nike signed 252 million and 250 million extension deals with Ohio State and Texas, respectively. UCLA's Under Armour contract that the guarantees that school 9 million in cash payouts annually. Like, whoa, those are
Big bucks.
huge numbers. That just was mind-boggling to me. Um, and you think about just how excited people are to wear their school swag and the t-shirts and the hats and the decals and the the Coke cans and all the things that you would buy at the school store. That's really interesting. And actually, speaking of UCLA and the West Coast, I wanted to ask you a question that because we have a one of the people I work with at my job, they went to USC in California.
Southern
So when they
Cal,
introduce
yes.
themselves, and he says, "Oh, he's like, I went to the real USC," and I'm like, "Oh, you shouldn't say that." But how do USC South Carolina fans, I don't know what I'm trying to like, how do you contend with the fact that you've got another school called USC, and is there
Yeah.
like a rivalry there? Is there like kind of tongue in cheek, haha, we're the best USC? How does that work in the fan world?
Yeah, there's always sort of been this this thing with the University of South Carolina because outside of the state of South Carolina, when people talk about USC, they're talking about Southern Cal.
Hmm.
Um, when people are talking about Carolina, chances are they're probably
Right.
talking about North Carolina. And so there's always sort of
Okay.
been this,
Yeah, what do we call?
this thing with Gamecock fans. I will say that we were a state, or we were a university before they were a state. So, you know,
Snap.
but
Historical shade.
that's right. That's right. But no, they're so far away that we've played a few times over the years, but it's not it's not really a real rivalry, and because we just don't play that much. But
Right.
uh, you know, uh, I, I think it's probably feels more like a rivalry to South Carolina people. Southern Cal people are very uh, self-assured. They have many national championships to their credit.
Yes. Hmm.
South Carolina has always sort of been this scrappy upstart, and so that probably has been a little bit more of a chip on our shoulder than anything. Uh, Probably more of a rivalry with South Carolina and North Carolina.
Yeah.
They've got the history with the ACC, and
Mm,
a lot of USC grads live up in Charlotte and here in the Triangle,
true.
and so we do have a little bit of a rivalry there. So
That's so funny. Would there ever, I mean, I guess there could one day be a possibility that the two USCs could play each other in the national championship.
could
I mean, it
happen.
could happen.
It could happen. Well, South Carolina played UCLA in the 2010 baseball national championship, so
Oh, there you go.
it could definitely
They were
happen.
almost.
Almost.
Um, so I'm curious now that we've gone through all the chapters, as you put this book together, was there kind of a favorite era you wrote about? And my other question would be, what surprised you the most in your research?
Yeah. So I had my own memories of the 80s. And so I remembered a lot of those times. It was really cool for me and interesting for me to dig into the 70s, the 1970s. So
Mm,
that era, and just to learn a little bit more about Frank McGuire and his program, and that's was kind of a sad story. They were sort of at the height of that program in 1971. They win the ACC championship, their final game as a conference member. a couple of months later, South Carolina officially leaves the ACC. That was really the height of South Carolina basketball. They were still good for a number of years after that, but without those heated rivalries, because ACC schools outside of Clemson refused to play South Carolina after they left. And
Oh.
so without those rivalries, and fans sort of lost interest.
Mm.
Coach McGuire was having to cobble together this national schedule, and they were playing good teams, but Houston and Canisius and Temple and good programs, but there was none of that sort of natural geographical rivalry that we
Oh,
enjoyed in the
okay.
ACC, and so uh, fans began to lose interest. He was getting older by this point. Recruiting started to fall off. They
Mm.
were not winning as much, and so that was kind of a hard one, a hard story to write. But yeah, the '70s. It was cool to just sort of dig into to that era that I didn't have any living memory of, and
Mm.
uh, and learn more about that. Um, Surprises. I think it was a surprise to me how close South Carolina came to getting back into the ACC. Those
Right.
those talks were real and they were serious, and it came pretty close. For a number of political reasons, that those talks kind of fizzled out. But I think there was a real possibility that South Carolina could have gotten back in, and I think that's sort of it would be an interesting alternate history to write.
Yeah.
What if that had happened?
Yeah. What if it had? Um, and then kind of thinking about your audience and the greater Gamecock fan kingdom, what do you hope readers will kind of take away from your book? What is the kind of not message, but what do you hope people, yeah, walk away with after they've read the book?
Yeah, just for people that lived through it,
Hmm.
uh, is is kind of a nostalgic book, just an opportunity to sort of settle back into the friendly confines of Carolina Coliseum and Sarge Frye Field, and experience some of those games from that era.
Hmm.
For people who weren't around back then, it's you know I mentioned earlier, there are people in their 30s that are having kids of their own now who have
Hmm.
no living memory of these times. And so
Right.
just an opportunity to kind of learn a little bit about uh, what things were like then, how we got to where we are now.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I think that for those two groups, I think that's what I would say would be in it for them.
I love that word nostalgia, and just you can just tell in your writing like how much this all means to you, how much it meant to you when you were a child, and I do love the stories of how things evolved over time. And I have to read this out loud too. Like before the facilities were updated back in the original basketball facility, the conditions were less than pleasant for visiting teams. Opposing coaches characterized it as a snake pit, among other less than glowing reviews. The pep band, which was always positioned directly behind the visitors' bench, wreaked havoc. Playing boisterously during timeouts, they often drowned out the instructions of the opposing coach. During a 1963 game between the Gamecocks and Duke, which must have been electric, well,
Yes.
trombone player kept moving his slide past the head of Duke's Jay Buckley, which the normally mild-mannered Buckley found so maddening that he grabbed the offending instrument and tossed it into the playing floor. Duke coach Vic asked
Bubas,
the
yeah.
official Bubas asked the officials if he could move his team to mid-court during timeouts, and when he did, USC cheerleaders surrounded the Blue Devils in a raucous war dance. Like, what a memory! What a great story that is. Love
Those
that.
were, that was before my time, but the stories from that, the Carolina Field House, it was a 3,200 seat um, field house, not even an arena, but just you think about the rivalries from those times, and the decorum was it lacked, it was
Black
lacking, I guess you
decorum.
could say. It was
Okay.
pretty wild times. You think maybe in the early mid 60s things were a little more buttoned up, but not so much at sporting events back then.
Oh my gosh. And then
Yeah.
kind of zooming out, I have a big lofty question for you. In writing your book, how how has kind of the Gamecock history shaped how you think about larger South Carolina history? Did it make you think about things differently? Did it confirm certain things you had always thought? I'm curious how you kind of think about things at a larger level now.
I love this question. And for me, I think there's a definite parallel
Mm,
between the University of South Carolina leaving the ACC
hmm
and the state of South Carolina seceding from the Union, 110, 111 years previous to that. Um,
mm,
and I don't mean to trivialize the Civil War. Obviously, we're
of
talking about much
course.
bigger, darker things
Yes.
there.
Yes.
But the point in that example is just this line of contrarianism that runs
Contr
through the
Good
state's
point.
history.
Yes.
Our institutions, or whether it's
Yes. Huh.
our politicians or government, or institutions of higher learning, they have this sort of desire almost to go their own way, to sort of buck the system,
hmm
um, for better or worse, or indifferent, however
Yeah.
you interpret that. There's definitely this strain of contrarianism
Yeah.
that is sort of
Absolutely.
consistent. And so that's sort of what I think about when I think about this era that I wrote about, and then the broader history of the state of South Carolina.
That really just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. That is so interesting. And as I've been researching South Carolina history, I too I have this feeling about the state, to your point, like over time. I don't think people realize how integral South Carolina, how long the history has been, how early it was,
Yeah.
how how incredibly important South Carolina history was in the beginning of our country. Again, pivotal battles in the Revolutionary War, pivotal generals, pivotal wins, pivotal losses. And then the Civil War, this idea that, we're going to stand up to the man, and what they thought was, they were, what their plan was for that. And we won't go into that, but like you're right. There's a sense of like contrarianism, like we're going to go our own way when we feel like it's, you're so right, Alan. It's so interesting. I love
Well,
it.
South Carolina has rarely met a bad idea that they were unwilling to take a leadership position on.
A bad
You
idea.
think about, I know you've heard this quote from James Pettigrew about South Carolina is too small for a republic
I
and too
have.
large for an insane asylum.
I have always wondered if that's a real quote, or did someone just like make that up and put it on a meme on the internet? Is it real?
It's
Do we think?
real. Yeah.
It's real.
Yeah. James Pettigrew. He said it in 1860, right as South Carolina was, withdrawing from the Union. And he was a South Carolinian, but he was against secession.
hmm
And so that was his assessment of the whole thing.
Do you think that a part of it, as I feel the kind of character of South Carolina and all of this, and this idea that we're going to go against the grain, we're going to speak up for ourselves, do you think it has to do with how in the beginning, the people who came here, they became almost like landed gentry of America? Like there was this kind of, not royal because we don't like monarchy or whatever, but there was like kind of like a royal kind of like we're going to respect everyone, but we are going to stand up for what we believe in. And I'm not really
Yeah.
explaining this correctly, but I just see South Carolina as having this kind of regal background that
Mhm.
makes it feel, um, courageous enough to say, no, we're not going to go in that direction. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
I absolutely do. Yeah.
Maybe
Well, it
yeah,
was
maybe regal is the right word. Hmm.
I think they certainly felt that way about themselves, and it was a really well along the coast anyway. It was
Yeah.
an incredibly wealthy um,
Yes.
colony. Certainly, Charleston was one of the wealthier cities in the country, and at the
Yes.
time, or in the world rather, and at the time was the fourth largest city in the colonies.
Hmm.
So you had a really wealthy, and of course that wealth was highly concentrated, and
Yes.
it was dominated by a certain segment of the population, and they were dead set on keeping it that way. And
Yes.
so there was, along with that wealth and opulence, came a certain arrogance too, I think,
Yes.
and a willingness to maybe risk everything to
Yeah.
maintain that status quo.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's a big part of the state's history for sure.
Did you ever watch the miniseries John Adams on HBO with
Yes,
Paul Giamatti? Do you
loved it.
remember when they are filming them, going over the wording of or voting to say if they're going to start the revolution or not? Do you remember that the South Carolinians were portrayed in this kind of foppish way where they were like wearing pink and like very regal outfit, and they were perfect and coiffed in the corner, and then you had like the New Englanders that looked all like scrappy and they're kind of browns and reds, and then the South Carolinians looked like they had come from England.
Yeah,
Do you remember? And I was so like, huh, like that is so interesting. And it kind of brings us to the point you and I are talking about. There's this kind of regal sense of um almost like an
exactly.
aristocratic sort of thing, but weren't they one of the last to hold out? I haven't I should dive into that history for the newsletter actually. But in the docu-series or in the series, they were like very stubborn. They were like, they were like the one of the last people to vote, remember? And it was like a big deal when they finally said yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think you had sort of South Carolina was maybe the counterbalance to Massachusetts up
Mm,
north. Those were maybe the two most important colonies politically back then, or
good point.
maybe influential, most
Yes.
influential colonies. Um, and I think there was a somewhat of a rivalry there too.
Mm,
But contrast that to North Carolina and Georgia on either side of South Carolina. Georgia was started as a penal colony. North Carolina was, a much more. You just didn't have the nearly the slave economy in North
mm,
Carolina that you had that dominated South Carolina. So just the colonies were so different. Their
yes.
economies were so different. Their cultures were so different.
Hmm.
People talk about the Carolinas, and these days it probably is. They are so similar,
Hmm.
but certainly in those days they're very different, and so yeah, it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, it is. Okay, a couple more questions for you. Very important. How can people best buy your book, A Gamecock Odyssey? Tell us where.
You can buy anywhere you purchase books. So I would encourage anybody to support your local bookstore. If
Yes.
it's not physically on the shelves, it can be ordered through your local bookstore. It is available on Amazon, of course, but USC Press also has a website where it can be purchased there as well. So
Hey, and are you in the bookstore?
I am I in? Well, I know. Let's see, a number of bookstores. I think Hub City probably still has some books. All Good Books in Columbia, I
Hmm.
believe, has some copies as
Oh,
well.
I
So
meant USC's bookstore.
yeah, I think so. I think there are some books down there as
Wow.
well. So
Very cool. That must
yeah,
be amazing for you to go and to see your book on the shelves there.
it was cool. And Melissa and I were just coming back from Isle of Palms over 4th of July week. We were down there with my family, and we stopped in Florence just for a pit stop, and went to the Barnes and Noble there
Mhm.
to get a coffee, and there were a couple of books on the shelves, and that was kind of neat to see. It
That's
was
so
kind of
cool.
kind
I
of
love
neat,
that.
yeah.
Okay, so people can buy it on Amazon, or hopefully they will support their local bookstore, or if they're at a USC game, they can buy it at the actual USC bookstore, which is
They
so
can
awesome.
certainly do that as well.
And then tell us a little bit too. I want to make sure we also give a plug for your Substack newsletter. So I've got, South Carolina History Newsletter. Alan has an amazing Substack too, and it's called South by Southeast, a Gamecock History. Obviously, he's got this incredible book, but for continued fanship after that, tell us a little bit about your Substack too.
South by Southeast. So this is my opportunity to, and you can probably relate to this. This is my opportunity to just totally geek out on
Yes.
whatever topic I feel like researching and writing about.
Mhm.
Um, the book was very much defined by that 20-year period.
Period.
Um, but I can really kind of go wherever I want to with this newsletter. So I've written about, all eras of Gamecock sports, and some about Columbia history. And so this is just a fun sort of side project for me. Um,
Yes.
and so yeah, anybody who's interested in certainly in Gamecock sports or Columbia history would encourage you to go check it out at South
Do
by
it.
Southeast.
Alan is such a beautiful writer, so everyone must go subscribe immediately after this.
You're kind.
Um,
I don't know who
mhm.
would be more surprised, my first mother-in-law or my eighth grade English teacher. About the fact that I wrote a book, but no, I appreciate you saying that. It's been a lot of fun for me, and just a cool creative outlet, like I said.
Yeah, and speaking of writing, actually writing the book and having it as a creative outlet, like how long? Oh my gosh, no. Oh no.
Don't forget to
It's another
stretch.
one. It said time for family reading. Um, so
That's
funny.
great.
How long did it take you to write this book? And did you have a specific kind of creative process you used? How did you keep discipline? Because writing a book is such a Herculean task that the average person, it's really kind of a daunting thing. How did you do it? How did you keep yourself disciplined?
Yeah.
And obviously you have a job, so you had to really kind of manage yourself and your time. How did you do it?
Yeah, it was trial and error, a lot of trial and error early on. I had written the first 3 or 4 chapters of the book by 2018 or so. I got to the women's chapter, the women's
Mhm.
sports chapter, and that was such a difficult topic,
Yes.
uh, a tough story, and I didn't know how to write it. I didn't
Yeah.
know if I even could write it.
Okay.
I didn't know if I should write it.
Yeah.
um, I actually set the book down for about a year and a half. I just
Wow. And
I
when was
couldn't.
that? Was that like 2020? When
This
was
was
that?
this would have been 2019, 2020 time frame
Wow. Okay. COVID
in
times. Yes.
COVID times. I had grand plans to pick it up and run with it again when COVID hit and we were all at home, and then that I still struggled with it, but eventually what happened was Gamecock Central, which is a fan website. They were kind enough to run a 3-part series of chapter one
Mm.
on their site, and a editor, an acquisitions editor from USC Press, happened to see that on Gamecock Central's Twitter
Wow.
feed,
Oh my
and
gosh.
reached out to me and said, "Hey, I see that you're working on a book. Are you working with a publisher?" And I said no,
Because that was going to be
but
my next. How did you find a publisher? And do you have an agent? Like, how did it
I,
all
I do
come
I
boil
do
down?
not I do not have an agent. The USC Press thing, I was so lucky.
It's
It
insane.
completely sort of fell into my lap, through that publication on Gamecock Central. The acquisitions editor just happened to see it on Twitter. If he had not been on Twitter that day, who knows if it ever would have happened. But it really was a very lucky chain of events. And so by August or September of 2021, I had a book contract. And then I was like, oh my God, I've got to finish this thing.
Yeah.
And
Oh my
so, and
gosh.
so,
Right.
yeah, I had about 9 months and about, 8 more chapters to write.
Hmm.
And so I fell into a pattern where I would take 2 weeks to
Hmm.
research and 2 weeks to write. And so I was
Mm.
cranking out about a chapter a month.
Okay.
And for me, with my day job, I figured out pretty quickly that by the time 5 o'clock rolls around, I'm toast. I can't,
Toast.
I just need to shut my brain off. So I figured out pretty quickly that early mornings were when I needed to do it. And so 5 to 7 or 7:30 every morning was when I did my work. And
Hmm.
it really just became, I have a lot of fun memories of just sort of squirreling myself away and researching and writing and during those early hours. And so
Wow.
that's how I did it. And it was a fun process. Things that I always wanted to know about anyway, something I would have done if it had never seen the light of day. So it was really gratifying that it finally did.
Oh my gosh. And when you were doing your research, how did you get your hands on like old newspapers? Did you sign up for like newspapers.com? Did you go to the library? Did you talk to librarians? Like, what was your strategy for like the primary source stuff and
Yeah.
newspapers and all that?
Yeah. Kind of a funny story. So when I first decided that I wanted to move forward with this, um, Melissa and I were down in Columbia, and I was at the Caroliniana Library on the Horseshoe,
Which I
which
really
is
need to go to. Can't
you
wait.
need to go to. It's a
Yeah.
beautiful building, and it's been refurbished now, so it's even more
I
spectacular.
saw
But
they
yeah,
won an award. They won a SC Preservation Award recently.
and they deserve it. They've done a phenomenal job with it. But this was shortly before they closed for renovations, and I was down there at a microfiche machine, scrolling through newspapers
Yes.
and going blind. And this really kind lady, Elizabeth West, who runs the library down there, she said, you don't have to do this. Everything's digitized now. You can go to Richland
Mhm.
County Library and they have this news bank database
Oh my
of
gosh.
newspapers. And so she literally saved my life
Oh
and
my gosh.
probably enabled this whole project. And so what it did for me though is it gave me this really deep sense of respect for pre-digital
Librarians.
age historians that
Oh yeah.
had to do stuff like that.
Yeah, going through all the microfiche. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And then so you would write in the morning. I like this idea that you were researching for 2 weeks and then writing for 2 weeks. And then and then and then after the 9 months, so they gave you a deadline. They said
Yeah.
after, okay. So that
Yeah.
also helped you because you were under the gun.
I had deadlines help with motivation and so yeah, I was able to get it done on time and then you know, obviously it's the first time I'd ever gone through this publishing process. It's a really, it kind of moves at glacial speed. There's so many
Glacial,
things that
really.
go into it. And so that was summer of 2022. I finished writing and it was finally published in November of 23. So
Okay.
yeah,
That's not that long ago. Oh my gosh. This past
just
November.
this past November.
Oh my
So
gosh. What a year. What an amazing year for you. That's awesome. And what other are there any other projects you have in the pipeline? Did the editors at the press say, Alan Piercy, you're a star. We need another book.
we'll we'll see when the check comes in the mail here. I will be happy if I break even with the postage costs of shipping books off to friends and family.
Friends,
If I
family.
break
Yep.
even, I'll be thrilled. But
Yeah.
I am in the beginning, the early stages of a new book project, and this is about Frank McGuire, the
Okay.
basketball coach, in his early years at South
Mm-hmm.
Carolina. So
Okay.
1964 to 1971, and the building of Carolina Coliseum, which is kind of an interesting story in and of itself. There was on the land where the Coliseum sits, uh, prior to the university purchasing that land, there was a community there, and it was a predominantly Black community,
Oh.
Ward One, and is what it was called. And
Wait, what was it called again?
Ward One,
Ward
uh,
One.
I
Okay.
guess they called it. It got its name because of the
Hmm.
voting district. But
I was like Ward. Okay. Interesting.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, it was a thriving community. There were stores and churches, and hundreds of people lived there, and so
Wow.
they were displaced. And you think about this. This is mid to late '60s when this is being planned and
Yeah.
executed,
Oh my
and
gosh.
so these folks were definitely at a disadvantage as
Yeah,
far as power and
absolutely.
representation. And so I think that's a story that
Oh,
I'm looking forward to diving into.
you have to write that book. Has anyone written a book about that? I I've
There's
never
a
heard
lot
of
of
that.
research out there right now, but I don't know
Oh
that there's any sort of book length
my gosh. You have to
project.
write that book. That is so exciting. And you can be in touch, I'm sure you're already thinking like being in touch with people whose ancestors lived there and just like stories that might have been passed down. Oh my gosh. What an incredible idea.
I
Yay.
think there's some rich earth to dig through there. So
Yeah.
and then fun times with the basketball program too. So I think combining those two stories, maybe back and forth between the two stories, that's sort of what I have in mind.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Fabulous. Well, Alan, thank you so much for doing this interview with me, for giving me so much of your time. We went so much longer than I anticipated, but we were just having so much fun and you were such a wealth of information. Can you hold up your book one more time so we can
Certainly.
I want people to see what it looks like. Everyone, please go buy Gamecock Odyssey by Alan Piercy, a wonderful book all about this wonderful era of South Carolina USC history. Alan, thank you again for being such a wonderful supporter of me, of the newsletter, and for being such a wonderful supporter and advocate of South Carolina history. And thank you for your time tonight. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate. It's been my honor and a real privilege to talk with you. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to
All
stop the recording and then we can keep talking though for a little bit longer. Okay,
right.
hold on. Okay. And oh, pause.